It happened on a Sunday afternoon, the kind of day where laughter and clinking silverware should have filled the air with comfort. I was sitting at my daughter's table, watching the steam curl from the casserole I'd baked, when the words dropped like a stone. "Stay in your lane, Mom. We don't need help." The fork in my hand froze. My son avoided my eyes. My daughter leaned back in her chair, arms crossed as if I were some stubborn child who hadn't learned her place. Around me, the room buzzed on. Small talk, the scrape of plates, a television murmuring in the background. Yet those 6 words carved a silence no one else seemed to hear. I smiled to hide the sting. But inside, something cracked. For decades, my advice had been lifelines. Now, it was dismissed like clutter in the corner of a room. That was the moment I realized. Maybe my family didn't want my wisdom anymore. But somewhere, someone still might. So let's get into what happened after that Sunday. The rest of the afternoon carried on as if nothing had been said, but for me, the air had shifted. I remember staring at the casserole dish, half emptied, wondering how something made with care could sit there ignored like background noise. They talked about work, vacations, the neighbor's new car, while I sat in the middle of my own family, feeling more like a guest than a mother. I nodded in the right places, even smiled when a joke passed around, but the echo of my daughter's words stayed in my head. "Stay in your lane." I kept testing the phrase, as though turning it over might soften its edges. Instead, it cut deeper with every repetition. To them, my advice was interference, my help an intrusion. On the drive home, I kept both hands tight on the steering wheel. The streets were familiar, yet felt different, as if every house I passed belonged to someone who had figured out where they were wanted. My own place in the world suddenly seemed uncertain. I wasn't angry. Not yet. I was more puzzled, like a student being told the rules of the class had changed without warning. When I walked into my living room, I dropped my keys on the counter and stood there, listening to the quiet. No voices, no demands, just silence. It was supposed to feel peaceful, but instead it pressed on me like a weight. For years, I had been needed. Calls for help with bills, late-night questions about parenting, recipes they couldn't quite master. Those small interruptions were proof that my presence still mattered. Now, that need had dried up in an instant. I thought back to when they were little. Back then, staying in my lane meant being everywhere at once. Nurse when they were sick, referee when they fought, driver when they needed to be somewhere in a hurry. There had never been a lane, just the whole road, and I carried them down it as best I could. Maybe that was the problem. I had stretched myself so wide across their lives that now, as adults, they felt I was blocking their way. I sat down at the kitchen table and opened my notebook. I've always kept one close, jotting down thoughts, recipes, sometimes just a grocery list. That night, though, I wrote a question across the page. What now? The pen hovered there after the words, waiting for an answer that never came. Sleep didn't come easily either. I kept hearing my daughter's tone, sharp but casual, as though she didn't know those words would lodge themselves inside me. I tossed and turned, staring at the ceiling, counting the faint patterns in the plaster like someone looking for a map. I tried telling myself not to take it personally, that maybe they were stressed. Maybe it was just the wrong timing. But beneath all those excuses, a new thought surfaced. What if they truly didn't want me involved anymore? The next morning, I moved through my routine slower than usual. Coffee tasted bitter, though I hadn't changed the brand. The newspaper headlines blurred together, none of them sticking in my mind. When the phone rang, I reached for it quickly, a reflex of hope, but it was only a telemarketer offering a service I didn't need. I hung up and stared at the quiet phone, realizing how much of my identity had been tied to the ring of family calls. By midday, I forced myself outside for a walk. The air was crisp, the sky a pale blue with streaks of white drifting lazily across it. My neighborhood had the same sights it always did. Gardens trimmed neatly, children riding bikes, dogs pulling at their leashes, but I felt like I was observing it all from behind a glass wall. People waved, and I waved back, yet the motions felt automatic, like I was filling a role rather than living it. As I walked, I thought about lanes again. Highways, sidewalks, grocery store aisles, They were all designed to keep order, to prevent collisions. But families weren't like that. Families overlapped, tangled, collided in messy, unpredictable ways. Maybe my children wanted order where I only knew closeness. Maybe my lane had never existed, except in their minds. When I returned home, I made tea and sat by the window. Across the street, my neighbor was setting up a "For Rent" sign in her front yard. She waved at me, and I found myself staring at the sign longer than her. The thought came quietly at first, then settled in with surprising steadiness. What if I found a new place to belong, a new way to be useful? If my children no longer needed me, perhaps someone else might. That evening, I pulled out my notebook again and scribbled another question beneath the first. Where could I take my energy now? The handwriting was firmer this time, not desperate, but searching. I didn't know the answer yet, but for the first time since that Sunday, I felt a spark of curiosity instead of hurt. The words, "stay in your lane," had been meant to keep me out, but what if they accidentally pushed me toward a lane of my own choosing? The next few days settled into a strange rhythm. I went about my chores as usual, laundry, dishes, sweeping the porch, but each task felt stripped of purpose. Before, these things were part of a larger picture, keeping the house in order for the family who visited, preparing meals to share, making a place where they could always return. Now the silence that followed each completed chore left me wondering, who was all this really for? I tried distracting myself with television, but the shows felt hollow. Characters moved through their scripted lives, solving problems in half an hour, while mine felt stuck on repeat. I opened old photo albums, thinking they might bring comfort, but they only deepened the ache. Every smile on those pages seemed to belong to a time when my presence was unquestioned. One morning, I found myself lingering over a picture of my younger self, hair pulled back, sleeves rolled up, carrying a child on each hip. My face looked tired, but steady. That woman had purpose. She didn't need permission to show up. She simply did. I closed the album and thought, maybe I've been waiting for validation that isn't coming. Maybe it's time I find a reason that doesn't depend on anyone else. Later that week, I got a call from my neighbor, Ruth. She's a widow, a few years older than me, and we sometimes exchange baked goods or chat across our fences. She asked if I could help her sort boxes in her garage. I said yes, without hesitation. It felt good to have someone need me, even if it was just for lifting dusty cartons. We spent the afternoon together, laughing over old knickknacks she'd forgotten she owned. She told me stories about her late husband's fishing trips and showed me a quilt she never finished. As I listened, I felt something I hadn't in weeks. Connection. It wasn't the same as family, but it was real. And it reminded me that usefulness doesn't vanish just because one group of people decides to set boundaries. Walking home afterward, I carried more than tired arms. I carried the thought that maybe I'd been shrinking my world too small, circling it around children who now had their own orbits. I had let their lives define mine, and in doing so, I'd neglected the parts of myself that existed beyond motherhood. That night, over tea, I scribbled another line in my notebook. I can expand. The words were simple, but they opened a window. What if the lane wasn't a narrow strip I had to stay inside? What if it was a wide road with room to wander, explore, even build something new? The next step came unexpectedly. Ruth mentioned that the community center nearby needed volunteers for their reading program. Children who struggled with books came after school to sit with adults who guided them through pages. At first, I hesitated. Did I still have the patience, the energy, the relevance? But then I thought back to the years I'd read bedtime stories, making voices for each character, turning the act of reading into an adventure. I knew I could do that again. So I signed up. The first afternoon, I walked into the center with nerves buzzing through me. The room was cheerful, walls covered in posters of animals, rockets, and fairy tales. At a table in the corner sat a boy with a scowl, arms crossed. His name was Daniel, and he had no interest in opening the book placed in front of him. I recognized that look. It was the same stubbornness my son used to wear when homework stood between him and the television. I didn't push. Instead, I asked Daniel about the picture on the cover, a dragon breathing fire. His eyes flicked to it, then back to me, testing whether I really cared. Slowly, he leaned in and said, "Dragons aren't real." I smiled. Maybe not, but in this story they are. Want to see how? He shrugged, but his hand reached for the page. By the end of the hour, he was reading sentences aloud, stumbling but determined. As he closed the book, he whispered, "Can we do another next time?" Walking home that evening, I felt a lightness I hadn't known in months. I wasn't filling a hole left by my family's rejection. I was stepping into something of my own. Daniel didn't see me as someone in the wrong lane. To him, I was simply someone who showed up. The more I volunteered, the more my days took shape again. Each child I worked with carried their own small battles: fear of mistakes, impatience, embarrassment, and each time they made progress, I felt a spark that reminded me of the best parts of raising my own children. But this time, it wasn't tangled in expectation or resentment. It was pure, simple presence. I began to notice changes in myself, too. My mornings carried a sense of direction. Even the chores felt lighter because they were no longer empty. They prepared me for a day with meaning. When the phone rang and it wasn't my children, I no longer felt disappointed. My circle of connection was widening. Of course, the ache didn't vanish entirely. There were still evenings when I longed for a call, a visit, a sign that my family saw me as more than someone to be managed. But now, those feelings didn't hollow me out. They reminded me I was human, capable of love, and still learning to balance closeness with independence. One Sunday, weeks after that first painful remark, I sat at my kitchen table writing in my notebook again. This time, I didn't write a question. I wrote a statement. My lane is where I decide to walk. Looking at those words, I felt something shift inside. Not a dramatic revelation, but a steadying. For the first time in a long while, I realized I wasn't waiting for permission anymore. Weeks at the center turned into months. I began to recognize the rhythm of the place, the shuffle of sneakers on linoleum, the smell of crayons and sharpened pencils, the laughter that broke out when a child finally conquered a stubborn word. The staff treated me as though I'd always belonged, not as an extra hand, but as part of the foundation. One afternoon, after a reading session with Daniel, he lingered at the table. His usual scowl softened. "You come here every week," he said. "Why?" I paused. No one had asked me that, not even myself in a direct way. "Because I like being here," I answered. "Because helping you matters to me." He nodded slowly, as if weighing the truth of my words. Then he whispered, "I'm glad you do." That was it. Just a few words. But they landed deeper than I expected. I walked home that day with a sense of belonging I hadn't felt in years. At home, my phone buzzed. It was my daughter. For a moment, I almost didn't answer. Not out of anger, but because I didn't feel desperate for her call anymore. When I picked up, her tone was polite, almost cautious. She asked if I could bring a dish to an upcoming family gathering. No invitation to stay over, no grand apology, just a small ask. I said yes, but this time without the weight of needing her approval. The gathering itself was familiar. Plates stacked, kids running through the hall, voices overlapping. But something inside me was different. When someone asked how I'd been spending my time, I didn't deflect. I spoke Abba, out the reading program. I described Daniel's progress and the joy of seeing children light up when a page finally made sense. To my surprise, the table quieted. My son, who usually checked his phone through most conversations, looked at me and said, "That's really good, Mom." My daughter, the same one who had told me to stay in my lane, shifted in her seat. "You never mentioned you were doing all that." "I didn't think you wanted to hear," I said, keeping my tone even. She hesitated, then admitted, "I guess I didn't know what you needed. I thought you'd always be there waiting." The words weren't a full apology, but they were closer than silence. For the first time, I didn't rush to fill the gap with comfort or reassurance. I let the pause breathe. And in that space, I realized I no longer needed her recognition to measure my worth. That night, back home, I sat at my notebook again. I wrote, "Family doesn't define my usefulness. Purpose isn't given. It's chosen." The truth settled over me like a steady warmth. My family could shift, pull away, even misunderstand me. But I had built a life that wasn't tethered to their approval. I had carved out a place where my presence was valued, not managed. The ache was still there, of course. Love doesn't just evaporate. But now, love no longer felt like a chain. It felt like a choice I could give freely, without erasing myself in the process. When spring returned, I noticed the air felt different. Not only outside with its warmer breezes, but inside me too. The center had planned a small appreciation event for the volunteers, and although it wasn't glamorous, it carried a weight I couldn't ignore. Rows of folding chairs, balloons tied with curling ribbons, and a table spread with cookies made the hall feel festive. I sat among the others, waiting, unsure whether this moment would mean anything beyond polite acknowledgement. When my name was called, I stood. The children clapped, quick, genuine bursts of sound that made my heart race. I accepted the certificate, a single sheet of paper, yet in that instant it felt like an anchor in my hands. No one here had known me as Mom or Grandma. They had only seen the hours I put in, the attention. For a few short seconds, I felt a shift. I was not an afterthought, not a burden, not someone trying to be useful. I was simply someone who mattered. Walking home after the ceremony, the evening air cooled my skin and carried with it the scent of freshly cut grass. My shoes clicked against the pavement, steady and deliberate. I thought back to that Sunday when my daughter's sharp words had silenced me at her table. Back then, I had walked away hollow. Today, I carried something fuller inside. I no longer needed an invitation to someone else's life to feel worthwhile. At home, I placed the certificate in a drawer. Not because it lacked meaning, but because the paper itself wasn't the prize. The prize was the proof that I had carved out a new place for myself. It wasn't loud or dramatic, but it was mine. That evening, I invited Mrs. Evans from down the block over for tea. She had recently lost her husband, and I sensed her loneliness the same way others had once sensed mine. We sat on the porch with mismatched mugs, the wood creaking beneath our chairs, watching the light soften across the street. I told her about the program, about Daniel and the children, about the hours spent sorting supplies or reading stories to the little ones. She leaned in, listening carefully, nodding when I admitted how different life felt now that I had stopped waiting for my family to validate me. "You sound lighter," she said finally. "Freer." Her words surprised me. I hadn't realized the change was visible to others, but hearing it out loud grounded the truth. Was no longer clinging to what had slipped away. I was standing, finally, on my own. A week later, my daughter called. Her tone was softer than it had been in months. She asked if I would join her for a walk in the park. Not a family gathering, not a favor, just time together. I agreed. When we met, we walked side by side on the gravel path. Birds flicked from tree to tree overhead, and children rode bicycles ahead of us, the wheels humming. The conversation between us moved without sharp edges. We spoke about her job, her kids, my volunteer work. For once, I didn't feel the pressure to give advice or prove my relevance. We were simply two women sharing space. There was relief in that, and something healing too. By the end of the walk, I understood that our relationship had changed for good. The role I once held as her guide had shifted. But instead of grieving it, I let it be. Children grow, parents age, and bonds evolve. What remains isn't authority, it's presence. That was enough. That night, I opened my notebook and wrote a line across the page. I am more than who I was needed to be. I stared at the words for a long time. They didn't just describe me. They claimed me. The notebook, now half filled with entries from the past year, had become both mirror and map. Each page traced the journey from the hollow silence at my daughter's table to the steady ground beneath my feet now. Closing the notebook, I felt no sense of an ending. Instead, I felt the pulse of continuation. My life wasn't wrapping up. It was still unfolding, this time on my own terms. I thought about the children at the center, about Mrs. Evans, about the quiet walks with my daughter. Every one of those moments held proof that I didn't need to beg for space in someone else's story. I was already writing my own. As I turned off the light and prepared for bed, I realized something else. The family conflict that once consumed my mind no longer defined me. It was part of my story, yes, but not the whole. Resilience had carried me forward, but acceptance had given me peace. And in that balance, I had discovered freedom. The weeks that followed seemed calmer, but not in the way life sometimes goes flat or dull. It was a calmer built on steadiness, like a river that finally finds its path after winding through rocks. I noticed myself settling into routines I never thought I'd enjoy. Mornings began with tea by the window where I watched neighbors head out for work or children shuffle toward the bus stop with backpacks bigger than their frames. Some afternoons I visited the center, not because I felt obligated, but because I genuinely wanted to be there. Other days I simply stayed home and allowed myself to rest without guilt. That was a change too. One afternoon, Daniel stopped me as I was leaving the center. He looked less hurried than usual, his jacket slung over his arm instead of buttoned tight. He said, "The kids keep asking when you're coming back. They like the way you read stories. You mean every word." I smiled, a little caught off guard. "Well, I do mean them," I replied. And I did. Every sentence, every picture book, every silly rhyme. I had thrown myself into those moments, and somehow the children felt that. It struck me then that sincerity didn't need decoration. You didn't have to prove it with elaborate gestures. Showing up and being present was often enough. At home later, I thought about the years I had spent trying to hold on to roles that had already shifted. Grandmotherhood, even being the reliable sibling or neighbor, those titles carried weight, but they weren't permanent. I had clung to them as if my worth depended on never letting go. But life had taught me something else. People evolve, and so do the spaces we occupy in each other's lives. It wasn't easy. Some nights I still caught myself missing the chaos of big family dinners, the clatter of dishes, the sharp exchanges that often came before the laughter. Even conflict, I realized, had been a kind of connection. Now, when I walked into my quiet kitchen, the silence pressed in differently. But instead of breaking me down, it reminded me to listen. To myself, to the present, to what I still had. Around this time, my daughter invited me over again. Not for a holiday, not for a large gathering, but for something smaller. She wanted help with her garden. I arrived in old shoes and a wide-brimmed hat, ready to dig. Together we knelt in the soil, our hands dirty, our knees sore. The conversation came naturally, mixed with laughter when the hose splattered mud across her jeans. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't a breakthrough, but it was something real. That afternoon marked the first time in years that I felt we were standing on the same ground. Not as mother and daughter locked in a push and pull, but as two people tending to life side by side. Later that evening, while washing soil from under my nails, I caught sight of myself in the mirror. There was nothing particularly striking about the reflection. Hair pulled back, face lined with age, a shirt stained from work in the garden. And yet, I felt proud. Not proud in the way of accomplishment or recognition, but proud that I hadn't allowed bitterness to harden me. Proud that I was still willing to show up, still willing to rebuild even after years of feeling dismissed. The following week, Mrs. Evans and I attended a local craft fair together. She had been hesitant at first, saying it would remind her too much of her late husband, but she came anyway. We wandered through stalls of handmade quilts, wood carvings, and jars of jam. At one table, she lingered over a basket of knitted scarves. I nudged her gently. "You should get one. Something warm for the winter." She smiled faintly. "Maybe next time." I realized then that healing wasn't a single event, but a slow gathering of courage. For her, showing up at the fair was already a step. For me, recognizing that was another lesson in patience. We don't all move at the same pace. Some of us just need someone beside us to keep us from turning back. Walking home afterward, I thought about how often I had demanded answers from life. Why had my family changed? Why had my daughter's words cut so deep? Why had my place at the table vanished when I still had so much love to give? I had searched for closure, but what I really needed was acceptance. Closure suggested something finished, sealed shut. Acceptance allowed for continuation, even if it looked different than before. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the living room filled with orange light, I opened my notebook again. I wrote, "I don't need everything to stay the same in order to feel whole." The line looked steady on the page, like it had been waiting there all along. It carried no desperation, no demand, just clarity. That night, I slept without dreams. In the morning, I felt ready for whatever lay ahead, not because the pain had vanished, but because it had found its place in the story. The loss of the old didn't erase the value of what was new. The ache reminded me of where I'd been, but the steadiness reminded me of where I was going. When people ask me now about that time, the season of distance, the arguments, the empty chair at my daughter's table, I don't soften the truth. I tell it plainly. It hurt. It nearly unraveled me. But I also tell them something else. It gave me the chance to rediscover myself outside of roles I thought would last forever. It forced me to step into places I'd never imagined, like that noisy community center with its peeling paint and mismatched chairs. And in doing so, it showed me that worth isn't something handed down by family or locked inside tradition. Worth is built each day, in choices both small and steady. So as the weeks turned into months, I carried myself differently. Not as someone trying to reclaim what had slipped away, but as someone ready to live forward. I still hoped for closeness with my family, but I no longer measured my life by it. I had learned to measure it by presence, connection, and the quiet courage to keep showing up. Time has a way of testing whether the lessons we claim to have learned actually settle into our bones or remain as words we rehearse. In the months after finding a steadier rhythm, I began to notice how often life presented me with small choices that revealed whether I was living differently or simply talking about it. These weren't grand, dramatic moments, but ordinary ones. Moments that could easily be brushed aside if I wasn't paying attention. One of the first came when a neighbor invited me to join a weekly walking group. At first, I hesitated. My instinct was to say no, to retreat into the comfort of routine. But something in me pushed against that old habit. So I agreed, and on Saturday morning I found myself lacing up sneakers and stepping into the cool air. The group wasn't large, just 6 of us, but each person carried a story. Some had lost partners, others were caring for aging relatives, one was recovering from an illness that had slowed her down. We didn't talk about our hardships directly, at least not at the start. We talked about gardens, recipes, the weather, books. Yet underneath, I sensed we were all there for something deeper than walking. We wanted to belong somewhere. As weeks passed, the walks became a ritual. Sometimes the pace was brisk, sometimes slower, but always steady. I found myself laughing at things I hadn't thought funny in years. One morning, as we paused to rest by a bench, one of the women looked at me and said, "You're always so grounded. You don't need to prove anything." I almost laughed out loud at that, remembering all the years I had spent desperately trying to prove my worth. But instead of explaining, I simply said, "I think I've just learned that being here is enough." And I meant it. That small group showed me that healing is not only about looking backward or even inward, it's also about leaning outward, finding new ways to connect. For so long, I had equated belonging with family alone, as if the bonds of blood were the only ones that mattered. But walking beside those neighbors, sharing stories and bits and pieces, reminded me that chosen connections could be just as strong, sometimes even more supportive. Another test came when my daughter called unexpectedly one evening. She sounded tired, her voice thin through the phone. "Mom," she said, "do you think you could watch the kids this weekend? I just need a break." For a moment, I didn't know how to respond. A part of me wanted to leap at the chance, to say yes without hesitation, to imagine this as a doorway back into the closeness I missed. But another part of me paused. I remembered the past, the times when being too eager had left me feeling small or unappreciated. I took a breath before answering. "Yes, I'd love to spend time with them. Just let me know what works best for you." That weekend, the house filled with the kind of noise I had once ached for. The sound of toys clattering, arguments over board games, bursts of laughter at cartoons. It was messy and loud, and for 2 days I felt a version of the life I used to know. Yet when the children left, I didn't crumble into the silence. I sat with it, let it surround me, and realized something important. I no longer needed those moments to define my worth. I enjoyed them deeply, but when they ended, I was still whole. At the center, Daniel began giving me more responsibility. He asked if I would consider leading a small project, collecting stories from the seniors about their lives and compiling them into a booklet for the community. At first, I resisted. "I'm not sure I know how to organize something like that," I said. But he only smiled. "You don't need to know everything. You just need to care enough to start." So I did. I sat with people over cups of tea, recording their memories on scraps of paper. Some spoke about war, others about childhood games. One man recalled learning to ride a bike down a dirt road in a town that no longer existed. Piece by piece, the stories formed a mosaic. What struck me most was how none of the people pretended to have lived flawless lives. They spoke of mistakes, regrets, and hardships as openly as they spoke of triumphs. Collecting their words gave me a gift too. It reminded me that my own story didn't need to be neat or without scars in order to matter. One afternoon, after finishing a round of interviews, I walked home slower than usual. The sun was low, and the street was alive with children playing soccer, their shouts echoing against the walls. I realized that for the first time in years, I wasn't comparing myself to anyone else's life. I wasn't measuring whether I had enough or whether I had failed to keep what others managed to hold. I was simply noticing the life in front of me. As the seasons shifted again, I felt myself becoming more comfortable in the in-between spaces, the spaces where relationships weren't fully healed but weren't entirely broken either, where silence sometimes stretched but didn't feel unbearable. There was strength in accepting those middle grounds because they allowed for growth. On a quiet night, I opened my notebook once more and wrote, "I don't need to return to what was. I only need to remain open to what is becoming." The sentence felt like a conclusion, but not an ending, more like a promise to myself to keep moving with the river, not against it. The most surprising part was how much lighter life began to feel. Not because it was suddenly easy, conflicts still surfaced and loneliness still visited, but because I had stopped wrestling with what couldn't be controlled. I had stopped trying to force people to see me the way I wanted to be seen. Instead, I let my actions speak in small, steady ways, showing up for neighbors, reading to children, listening to stories, answering the phone without resentment. I won't pretend that everything became perfect. There were still days when memories stung, when I longed for things to be different. But I carried those feelings differently now. They were no longer weights pressing me down. They were reminders of the love I was capable of giving, even if it wasn't always returned in the way I hoped. Looking back, I realized that the turning point hadn't been a single dramatic moment but a series of choices, choosing to walk with strangers, choosing to say yes to my daughter without losing myself, choosing to collect stories, choosing to see silence not as punishment, but as space. And with each choice, I rebuilt a sense of self that no one else could diminish. In the end, I discovered that life after heartbreak doesn't mean stitching things back exactly as they were. It means learning to live with the new pattern, uneven but beautiful in its own way. And just maybe, that's what strength really looks like. Not erasing the cracks, but carrying them with grace and continuing forward anyway. The changes I had been living through didn't arrive with sudden fanfare. They settled in slowly, like the way dawn light stretches across a room until you realize you're no longer sitting in the dark. What surprised me most was how those shifts revealed themselves not during big events, but in ordinary exchanges, the kind of moments that, years earlier, I would have brushed past without noticing. One such moment happened at the grocery store. I was standing in line, my basket half full, when the woman ahead of me struggled with her bags. Her hands shook slightly as she tried to gather them all. Without thinking, I stepped forward and said, "Let me help you carry those." She looked at me for a long second, as if weighing whether to trust a stranger, then nodded. As we walked out to the parking lot together, she told me she had recently lost her husband and hadn't yet gotten used to doing everything alone. I listened, and for once, I didn't try to fix her pain or offer neat words. I simply stood with her until her bags were in the trunk, and she thanked me. Driving home, I realized I had been given a glimpse of myself from years before. Someone trying to hold too much without knowing how to ask for support. And in helping her, I felt a quiet circle close. Life has a way of sending reminders like that, not grand lessons, but nudges that say, remember where you've been, remember how far you've come. Around the same time, Daniel suggested we present the story booklet project to the larger community. The idea both excited and unsettled me. Sharing private memories collected from others felt like a responsibility I didn't want to mishandle. But Daniel reassured me that the point wasn't perfection. The point was to honor lives that often go unheard. So, one crisp evening, we set up chairs in the community hall. The room wasn't large, but it filled quickly with neighbors, families, and friends of those who had contributed their stories. As I stood at the front, booklet in hand, I felt a nervous tremor move through me. Public speaking had never been my strength. But then I saw the faces in the crowd, many of them the same people who had trusted me with their memories. Their eyes didn't demand eloquence, they asked only for honesty. I read excerpts aloud. A man's memory of fishing with his father. A woman's recollection of writing secret letters during wartime. A boyhood story of sneaking apples from an orchard that no longer existed. Each piece carried the weight of a life both ordinary and remarkable. As I spoke, I noticed tears in the audience, but also laughter. By the time we finished, the room felt lighter, as though everyone had been reminded that their own stories mattered too. Afterward, an older gentleman approached me. "You've got a gift," he said. "Not just for gathering words, but for making people feel seen." His comment lingered with me. For so long, I had been the one desperate to be noticed, desperate to feel like my presence counted. Now, without chasing it, I was learning that giving attention could be just as fulfilling as receiving it. But growth never moves in a straight line. There were still difficult days, yes, especially when silence stretched between my daughter and me. Sometimes she would call. Sometimes weeks passed without a word. I still caught myself wondering what she truly thought of me, whether she judged my choices, whether she carried disappointments she never voiced. Those questions didn't vanish. But instead of letting them consume me, I began to place them gently to the side, like setting down a heavy bag after carrying it too far. They were there, yes, but they didn't have to be held every moment. It was during one of those silent weeks that I received an invitation from my walking group. They wanted to plan a short trip together, a few days by the coast, nothing fancy, just time away. In the past, I would have hesitated, worried about being a burden, worried about whether my family would see it as frivolous. But this time, I said yes. The trip was simple. Shared meals, long walks on the beach, late-night conversations over tea. Yet something shifted in me as I sat by the ocean, watching waves crash in endless rhythm. For the first time, I allowed myself to think about possibility instead of loss. Not what I no longer had, but what might still lie ahead. It was a startling realization that life wasn't only about enduring, it was also about allowing new beginnings, no matter my age. Returning home, I carried that perspective with me. I began to say yes more often, to invitations, to chances, to small adventures I once would have dismissed. I joined a class on photography at the center, learned how to handle a camera, and found joy in capturing the quiet details of daily life. A child chasing pigeons, a shadow falling across a wall, a hand reaching for another. Through the lens, I saw that beauty wasn't confined to grand gestures. It lived in moments most people overlooked. As these new parts of life unfolded, I realized something profound. Healing isn't about erasing scars. It's about weaving them into the fabric of who we are, so they no longer feel like reminders of failure, but like evidence of survival. I could look back on the years of heartbreak without collapsing under their weight, because they were no longer the whole story. They were just chapters that had led me here. The day my daughter came by with her children, unplanned and without ceremony, I understood how far I had traveled inside myself. She didn't stay long, just dropped them off while she ran errands. But when she returned, she lingered for a cup of tea. The conversation was light, nothing groundbreaking. School updates, a new recipe, the weather. Yet sitting there, I realized I no longer hung on every word searching for hidden meaning. I no longer treated her presence as proof of my worth. I could enjoy her company without demanding it fill every empty corner. And that, in itself, was a victory. As evening fell that day, I walked her to the car. She gave me a brief hug before driving off, and I stood in the driveway watching her taillights fade. There was no dramatic reconciliation, no sudden flood of closeness, but there was peace. And peace, I had learned, was enough. Looking ahead, I don't pretend to know what the future holds. Relationships may shift again, silence may return, or new joys may emerge. What I do know is that I will meet those changes with steadier hands than before. I will carry both the cracks and the strength because they belong together. And if there's one truth these years have taught me, it's this. We don't have to rebuild the same house we once lived in. We can build a new one, brick by brick, even if it looks nothing like the past. And sometimes, that new house feels more like home than the old one ever did. The weeks after my dog H'ter's visit unfolded in a rhythm that felt both ordinary and quietly new. There was no grand declaration that our relationship had mended, no dramatic moment of closure. Instead, it was the small consistencies that told me something had shifted. A quick text to ask if I needed anything from the store, a photo of the children at a school play, an unexpected knock at the door on a Sunday afternoon. Each of these was a thread. Woven together, they began to form a fabric stronger than the silence that had once defined us. During those weeks, I often thought about how much of my life I had once spent waiting for recognition, for apologies, for circumstances to be different. But waiting had kept me tethered to absence. Now, instead of waiting, I tried to participate. If my daughter reached out, I responded with warmth but without expectation. If she didn't, I didn't let the absence undo me. It was a delicate balance, but one that gave me a sense of steadiness I hadn't known before. Meanwhile, the walking group continued to be a steady anchor. We planned routes that led us through parks, past rivers, and into corners of the city I had never bothered to notice. On one of those walks, someone suggested we document our journeys with photos, much like we had done with the Life Stories project. So I began bringing my camera, not just to capture scenery, but to frame the small interactions that often went unnoticed. Someone tying another's shoelace when it came undone, the way a friend paused to point out a blooming tree, the laughter that burst when someone slipped in the mud. These snapshots were not just pictures. They were reminders that life wasn't about monumental events, but about the texture of everyday companionship. The photography class I had joined earlier grew into something more than a hobby. I found myself lingering after lessons, swapping tips with classmates, and even entering a small local contest. I didn't win, but one of my photos, a child's hand gripping a balloon string against a cloudy sky, was displayed on a wall at the community center. Standing in front of it, I felt a rush of quiet pride. It wasn't about recognition. It was about seeing proof that I was capable of learning, creating, and offering something that might touch another person. Around that time, Daniel and I organized another gathering at the community hall, this time combining the photo project with readings from the earlier story collection. We called it an evening of shared memory and perspective. The turnout surprised us. The hall filled even faster than before. People clapped not because the stories were polished or the photos professional, but because they recognized themselves in the fragments of each other's lives. I could see neighbors exchanging knowing glances, nodding at details that echoed their own experiences. By the end, several people asked how they could contribute next time. That was when I realized this wasn't just a one-off project anymore. It was becoming a tradition. One evening, after a long walk home, I sat by the window and thought about how far I had come. Years ago, I wouldn't have believed such peace was possible. Not the absence of pain, but the presence of something fuller that existed alongside it. I remembered nights when loneliness felt like a wall pressing in on all sides, when I thought the rest of my life would be defined only by what I had lost. Now, I saw clearly that life had expanded. The cracks had not vanished, but light had found its way through them. Yet even with these changes, I remained cautious. There were still days when a memory would surface and my chest tightened with regret. There were still conversations with my daughter where I wanted to say more than I did, where I wanted to ask questions I wasn't sure she was ready to answer. But I reminded myself that growth didn't mean erasing the past. It meant living with it without letting it dictate every tomorrow. A turning point came one Saturday morning when my daughter called, her voice lighter than usual. She asked if I would join them for a family picnic. The invitation was simple, but it carried weight. For the first time in years, she wanted me not as a babysitter, not as someone to fill a gap, but as part of their day. I accepted without hesitation. That afternoon, we spread blankets under the trees at the park. The children ran barefoot through the grass, chasing each other in circles, their laughter carrying across the field. My daughter sat beside me, unpacking sandwiches and fruit. We didn't speak of the past. We didn't need to. Instead, we shared the moment in front of us. At one point, she leaned back against the tree and closed her eyes. The sunlight caught her hair, and for a moment I saw not just my grown child, but the little girl she once was, running into my arms after school. Driving home later, I thought about how fragile and precious progress can be. It doesn't always arrive with closure or forgiveness spelled out in words. Sometimes it looks like sitting quietly in the same space without tension, eating sandwiches while children laugh nearby. Sometimes that is enough. From that day forward, I stopped framing my life as something broken in need of fixing. I started seeing it as something evolving, shaped by both what had gone wrong and what was still going right. I began keeping a journal, not of complaints, but of glimpses worth remembering. A flower that bloomed outside my window. A phone call that lasted longer than expected. A photo that turned out better than I thought it would. These small entries built a kind of quiet archive of gratitude, a reminder that even on the harder days, there was always something worth noting. And so, as time moved forward, I realized the greatest shift wasn't in my daughter or even in my surroundings. It was in me. I no longer chased after validation the way I once had. I no longer believed my worth depended on whether someone else approved of my choices or my presence. Instead, I carried an understanding that life, with all its bruises and openings, was still offering me chances to live, to give, and to receive. Looking back, I see now that survival was only the first step. What came after survival, rebuilding, connecting, finding joy again, that was where true living began. And if I could offer anything to someone standing where I once stood, I would say this: don't wait for the perfect moment, the perfect apology, or the perfect plan. Start where you are, with what you have. The rest unfolds in ways you can't predict, but often in ways that surprise you. So with the picnic still fresh in my mind, life began to carry a different rhythm. It wasn't that everything had suddenly transformed, but I could feel the weight of past years beginning to loosen its grip. The sharp edges of memory still existed, but they no longer cut into my daily life the way they once did. I found myself moving through my days with a steadier pace, less focused on what had been lost and more attentive to what was quietly unfolding. My mornings often began with the journal I had started keeping. What surprised me most was how simple the entries were. I didn't write about grand achievements or detailed reflections. Instead, I jotted down fragments of the day that had touched me in some way. A neighbor waving as I watered the plants, a message from my daughter about her son's school project, a smile exchanged with a stranger on the bus. These notes grounded me in the present and gave shape to days that might otherwise have slipped past unnoticed. At the community center, our projects continued to grow in ways none of us had expected. Daniel suggested combining our photography with oral recordings, creating a living archive that captured both voice and image. We began experimenting with short interviews, asking people not just to share stories of the past, but to talk about what made them hopeful for the future. Listening to those recordings later was humbling. People spoke with such honesty about small things that mattered. Watching a grandchild learn to ride a bike, planting seeds in a community garden, waiting for the arrival of a letter from a friend abroad. I realized that hope often lived in the ordinary details, and that gave me a new way of looking at my own life. One afternoon, while editing some of those recordings, I received an unexpected call from my daughter. She sounded flustered, explaining that she had a late work meeting and couldn't make it home in time for her children's pickup. She asked if I could step in. In the past, a request like that might have stirred complicated feelings, leaving me unsure whether she saw me as reliable or merely convenient. But this time, I didn't let those doubts take over. I simply said yes. When I arrived at the school, my grandchildren ran into my arms with the kind of unrestrained energy that only children seem to carry. Walking them home, listening to their chatter about homework and playground games, I felt a quiet contentment. Later that evening, as I tucked them in, my granddaughter whispered, "I like when you're here." Those words stayed with me long after I left the house. It wasn't about being needed in a practical way. It was about being present in their lives in a way that felt natural, unforced, and genuine. That small moment opened a door I hadn't realized was waiting. In the weeks that followed, I spent more time with the children. Sometimes it was as simple as helping with homework. Other times it was baking in the kitchen or playing board games on the living room floor. Each visit chipped away at the distance that had once defined my relationship with my daughter's household. Without us saying it outright, we were rebuilding something that resembled trust. Outside of family, the walking group had become more adventurous. One Saturday, we planned a trip outside the city, following a trail that wound through fields and forests. It was longer and more challenging than our usual routes, and there were moments when I doubted whether I could keep up. But every time I slowed, someone matched my pace. Every time I considered turning back, a voice encouraged me to continue just a little further. By the time we reached the final clearing, with the sun beginning to set, I felt a surge of pride not just in finishing the walk, but in the collective effort that had carried us all there. That evening, sitting around a shared meal, we talked about what had brought us to this point. I admitted that there was a time when I felt invisible, when I believed the second half of life would be a narrowing of possibilities. Others nodded, sharing their own versions of that fear. And yet here we were, expanding instead of shrinking, finding friendships and energy in places we hadn't expected. It struck me then that the community we were creating wasn't about replacing what had been lost, but about proving that life could continue to grow in directions we hadn't imagined. My photography became part of that growth too. I started taking portraits of people in the group, capturing their faces in moments of laughter, concentration, or quiet rest. I wanted to show them as they were, unpolished, but real. When I printed the first set of photos and handed them out, I saw the way people looked at themselves, sometimes surprised, sometimes moved. It reminded me that being seen through another's eyes can be a gift, one that affirms existence in a way words rarely do. Amid these developments, I kept reflecting on the changing dynamic with my daughter. One evening, as we cleared the table after dinner at her house, she paused and said, "I know we've had difficult years." Her voice was steady, but softer than I expected. I didn't rush to fill the silence. Instead, I waited, letting her continue in her own time. She went on to say that while she couldn't rewrite the past, she wanted to keep moving forward, to create new patterns for her children's sake, as well as her own. I felt a mixture of relief and caution. It wasn't a sweeping apology or a dramatic reconciliation, but it was a step. And I realized that I didn't need more than that in the moment. We had already come further than I once thought possible, and trying to force the process might only strain it. So I told her simply that I was grateful we were finding our way again, and that I wanted the same thing she did. A future where being together didn't feel heavy. As I left her house that night, I thought about how healing often looks less like a sudden transformation and more like a series of small, consistent gestures. Each shared meal, each walk, each phone call was a piece of the repair. None of them alone could change the past, but together they built something steady enough to hold on to. Looking back on that period now, I can see that my life wasn't defined by one single turning point, but by many small ones stacked together. The first time I joined the walking group, the first photo I shared, the first knock on the door from my daughter after years of silence. Each moment was a brick in a foundation I didn't even realize I was building at the time. And perhaps that's the lesson I've carried most deeply, that rebuilding a life isn't about chasing one grand solution, but about choosing, again and again, to show up. To answer the phone, to accept the invitation, to write the journal entry, to take the step forward even when the ground feels uncertain. Those choices, small as they seem, are what shape the future. So with the slow rebuilding of trust underway, I began to notice how my world looked different even on ordinary days. It wasn't dramatic, but the difference was steady. I woke up without the same heaviness that used to greet me in the mornings. My routines didn't feel like burdens anymore. They felt like choices. Even something as simple as making tea or folding laundry carried a rhythm that felt calmer. The absence of constant inner noise gave space for new thoughts to form. One change I hadn't expected was how naturally people started inviting me into things. It wasn't always large events. Sometimes it was a neighbor asking if I wanted to join them on a trip to the market, or someone from the walking group wondering if I'd like to visit a museum exhibit with them. These invitations made me realize how long I'd kept myself apart. For years, I told myself that isolation was easier, that avoiding closeness protected me. But now, being included felt like a quiet reminder that I belonged somewhere. I also started to experiment with creating spaces in my home that reflected who I was becoming. I cleared shelves that had been filled with items tied to years of disappointment. Instead, I placed photographs from recent outings, sketches my grandchildren made, and a few plants that I learned to care for. My living room began to look less like a collection of the past and more like a place where life was continuing to happen. It was a physical shift, but it mirrored the inner one. The work with the community center reached a stage where our project was displayed in a small gallery. It wasn't a polished exhibition, just a set of photographs and audio clips arranged with care. Yet walking into that room and seeing the images on the walls, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Pride in contributing to something bigger than myself. People lingered by the recordings, leaning closer to hear voices telling stories of resilience, humor, and persistence. Standing in that space, surrounded by the work we had created, I realized we had given shape to an archive of ordinary strength. After the event, a man approached me quietly. He said he recognized himself in one of the photos, not literally, but in the way another person's face carried an expression of both fatigue and determination. He told me that seeing it made him feel less alone. His words stayed with me long after. They reminded me of what I had been seeking all along. Not to erase pain, but to know it was shared. Around the same time, my daughter and I began to settle into a more natural rhythm. We didn't force long conversations about the past. Instead, we built new moments step by step. There were still silences between us, but they didn't feel hostile anymore. One Sunday afternoon, while I sat with her children playing cards, she came into the room, handed me a cup of tea, and sat beside me. We didn't say much, but the act itself felt like a truce. We were learning to live side by side again, without the constant pull of old wounds. Even so, I had to remind myself not to measure progress against an ideal picture. There were days when doubts returned, days when I wondered if my daughter truly saw me differently, or if the ground between us could still crack open. On those days, I leaned back on the lessons I had been practicing, taking walks, writing in my journal, showing up for the small commitments I had made. It wasn't about never slipping back. It was about choosing not to stay down when I did. One late evening, I received a call from a woman in our walking group. She said she had lost her husband years ago and had spent a long time withdrawing from everyone. She admitted that seeing me re-engage with life gave her the courage to do the same. I didn't know what to say at first. Part of me still struggled to see myself as someone who could inspire anyone. But as I listened, I realized this was exactly how healing worked. Not as a solitary journey, but as something that rippled outward, quietly encouraging others to step forward too. As winter turned into spring, I noticed how the seasons mirrored my own state of mind. Where once the shift in weather felt irrelevant, now I found myself pausing to take in small signs. Buds appearing on branches, light lasting a little longer into the evening, the sound of children playing outside again. It wasn't that I hadn't seen these things before. It was that now they carried weight. They reminded me that life renews itself, even after long stretches of stillness. I began setting goals that felt manageable, not grand resolutions, but things that gave shape to my weeks. One goal was to finish organizing the photo albums I had abandoned years ago. As I sorted through them, I found images of my children when they were small. For the first time in a long time, I looked at those photos without bitterness. Instead, I saw the fullness of those years, the mess, the laughter, the effort. It didn't erase the difficulties that followed, but it reminded me that my story wasn't defined only by loss. Another goal was to host a small dinner at my home. It had been years since I invited people over, but I decided it was time. The night came, and I cooked a simple meal, nervous about whether the gathering would feel awkward. Instead, it unfolded with ease. People filled the room with conversation, laughter, and the kind of warmth that can't be forced. As I washed dishes later, I realized the evening had marked a quiet milestone. My home, once filled with silence, was alive again. Perhaps the most meaningful change, though, came in the way I began to view myself. For a long time, I had carried the label of someone left behind, someone diminished by choices and circumstances outside her control. But gradually, through these experiences, I began to see myself not as broken, but as still in motion. My worth wasn't tied to what I had lost, but to the fact that I was still here, showing up, taking part. Looking back now, I think the most powerful realization was that healing didn't arrive all at once. It came in small acts, answering a call, joining a walk, saying yes when my daughter asked for help, daring to share my work in public. Each of these moments was like a stitch pulling the fabric of my life together again. Alone, might have seemed small. Together, they formed something steady enough to hold me. And that is where I found myself, not at the end of a story, but in the middle of one that continues to unfold. I no longer wait for some final moment of closure. Instead, I live in the process itself. Every day is another chance to choose presence over absence, connection over retreat, renewal over resignation. That is enough. As life kept moving forward, I began to think less about repairing the past and more about what kind of future I wanted to shape. That shift in focus didn't happen suddenly. It came after many small realizations that showed me I had more control than I once believed. I started asking myself different questions. Instead of, "Why did this happen?" I asked, "What can I do with where I am now?" That one change in perspective opened new doors I had never considered before. One of the most important lessons I carried with me was that stability doesn't come from avoiding pain, but from learning how to live with it without letting it run everything. For a long time, I thought I had to reach a place where nothing hurt anymore, where betrayal, distance, and loss had no hold on me. But I learned that's not how life works. The past doesn't disappear. It softens, it shifts, and it becomes something you learn to walk alongside instead of something that weighs you down every step. The more I leaned into that truth, the more I felt a sense of freedom. I realized I didn't need to rewrite every chapter of my story. What mattered was the choices I made from here on. If I wanted to spend time with my grandchildren, I could. If I wanted to create projects with people at the community center, I could. If I wanted to travel to see places I had only read about, I had the power to make that choice. Recognizing that freedom changed how I approached each day. I remember sitting with a friend at a cafe one afternoon, both of us sipping tea as the street outside filled with the usual noise of traffic and conversation. She asked me what had made the biggest difference in how I saw myself. I told her it wasn't a single event, but a steady practice of showing up even when I didn't feel ready. It was joining the walking group, answering phone calls instead of ignoring them, and trying again with my daughter even after years of silence. Each act was small on its own, but together they shifted the way I lived. What surprised me most was how purpose slowly began to take root. At first, I didn't think I had anything to offer. But the more I engaged, the more I saw that simply sharing experiences had meaning. People responded not to polished answers or perfect stories, but to honesty. When I spoke about the times I had felt forgotten, or the nights I lay awake wondering if I mattered, others admitted they had felt the same. It built a kind of trust that didn't require perfection. It only required truth. There was a moment when I realized how far I had come. It happened during a gathering at the community center. I was asked to give a short talk about our project. Standing there, looking at faces turned toward me, I expected to feel the old fear of judgment. But instead, I felt calm. My voice didn't shake. My words came easily. And for once, I wasn't telling my story to justify myself or to win sympathy. I was telling it to share how resilience takes shape in ordinary lives. When the talk ended, the applause was gentle but steady, and I felt an inner certainty I hadn't known before. The changes weren't only public, they were deeply personal too. At home, I created a corner where I could write each morning. It wasn't about producing something polished. It was about clearing space for reflection. Over time, these pages formed a map of my journey, where I had been, what I had struggled with, and where I was heading. Looking back through them, I could see how my thoughts had shifted from anger and grief to possibility and connection. My relationship with my daughter also continued to grow. We still had moments of distance, but the difference now was that we didn't let them expand into silence that lasted for months or years. If something felt strained, we found ways to talk about it. Sometimes it was direct, other times it was through simple gestures like sharing a meal or sitting in the same room without forcing conversation. These moments reminded me that healing within families doesn't come in dramatic reconciliations. It comes in choosing to stay again and again, even when it's uncomfortable. I began to see myself less as someone who had been wronged and more as someone who had survived. That shift was crucial. It took me out of the role of victim and placed me back into the role of participant in my own life. I could no longer deny that betrayal had shaped me, but it didn't have to define me. What defined me was how I responded afterward, how I chose to keep walking, keep reaching, keep building. Legacies started to cross my mind more often, not in a grand way, but in the sense of what I would leave behind for the people closest to me. I thought about the kind of story my grandchildren might one day tell about me. Would they say I was someone who let bitterness dictate her days? Or would they remember me as someone who kept moving forward despite it all? I knew which story I wanted them to tell. That thought became a quiet motivation. It wasn't out pretending everything was fine. It was about living in a way that showed them resilience, honesty, and courage. When I spent time with them, I didn't try to hide my past, but I didn't let it dominate the present either. I showed them through action that it's possible to experience hardship and still laugh, still create, still connect. I realized, too, that part of building a meaningful life was not just receiving support, but offering it. I started mentoring younger women at the community center, many of whom were going through their own struggles. Some had lost jobs, some had difficult family situations, some were just trying to find their footing. I didn't give them perfect solutions. I shared what I had learned, that healing isn't about erasing the past, but about learning to live alongside it without letting it control you. The work gave me a sense of purpose I hadn't expected. Each conversation felt like planting seeds. I might not see how those seeds grew, but I knew the act itself mattered. Offering even a small bit of encouragement was proof that my pain hadn't been wasted. It had been transformed into something that could help someone else feel less alone. One evening, as I walked home from the center, I thought about how far I had come. The streets were quiet, the air cool, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel like an outsider in my own life. I felt present, grounded, capable of meeting whatever came next. I knew there would still be challenges, still be moments when doubts returned. But I also knew I had built a foundation strong enough to hold me through them. Looking back, I see now that the story isn't about betrayal alone. It's about the choice to continue. It's about the courage to step into rooms when I wanted to hide, to open my heart when I wanted to close it, to create when I thought I had nothing left to offer. That choice, repeated day after day, became my new life. And as I move forward, that's the part I hold on to most. The knowledge that I am not defined by what happened to me, but by what I choose to do now, and tomorrow, and the day after that. As the months moved into years, I began to understand that the real measure of healing wasn't found in whether everything was fixed, but in how I carried myself through the days that still held uncertainty. Life didn't suddenly become smooth, but I learned to live in a way that made peace possible, even when things were far from perfect. That was the quiet reward of everything I had been working toward, a steadiness that came not from avoiding hardship, but from knowing I could handle it when it arrived. The patterns that had once weighed me down no longer held the same control. I no longer walked into family gatherings with the expectation of conflict or rejection. I entered them with a calm awareness that people will be who they are, and my worth does not depend on their approval. That understanding was a breakthrough. It lifted years of tension from my shoulders and allowed me to interact with relatives from a place of choice, not obligation. What I didn't expect was how much lighter life began to feel when I stopped demanding closure from people who were never going to give it. For so long, I thought I needed explanations or apologies to move on. But over time, I discovered that waiting for them only tied me to the past. Releasing that expectation gave me back energy I didn't even realize I was losing. With that energy, I began to invest more fully in what was right, in front of me. I used that freedom to build routines that grounded me. Early mornings became my time of reflection. Afternoons often belonged to projects or community work. Evenings were when I connected with my family, whether through a phone call, dinner, or simply sitting quietly with my daughter and grandchildren. Creating this balance taught me that joy isn't always about chasing new experiences. Sometimes it's about appreciating the rhythms that make life feel steady and meaningful. One of the most memorable moments during this time came when my granddaughter asked me to help her with a school project about family history. At first, I hesitated, thinking about the parts of our story that were painful. But as we sat together, flipping through old photographs, I realized this was an opportunity not to hide the past, but to show her the strength that came from it. I told her about my parents, about the struggles of my early years, and yes, about the difficulties that later shaped me. But I emphasized how I had grown, how I kept moving forward, and how every step brought me to the life I had with her now. The look in her eyes told me she understood not just the facts, but the resilience behind them. That experience reminded me of something important. We don't tell our stories to dwell on pain, but to pass on the lessons that can help the next generation walk with more courage. Sharing with her helped me see that my journey, while filled with difficult chapters, also held wisdom worth passing down. It turned what once felt like shame into something purposeful. Community work continued to deepen that sense of purpose. I became more involved in mentoring women who were navigating their own challenges. Sometimes I listened quietly as they spoke about betrayal, loss, or feeling invisible. Other times I offered practical guidance, how to build supportive networks, how to take small steps when everything feels overwhelming, how to trust themselves again after being broken down by others. These conversations didn't solve every problem, but they reminded both them and me that strength grows in connection. There was one woman in particular who stayed in my thoughts. She had recently gone through a separation and was struggling to rebuild her life. She often told me she felt like she was failing her children. I shared with her the moments I had once felt the same way, how I had questioned my worth as a mother. Over time, she began to see that her effort to keep showing up was itself proof of her love. Watching her slowly regain confidence was like watching a mirror of my own journey. It was humbling and affirming at the same time. The more I poured into others, the more I realized that meaning is built in layers, not single grand gestures. A conversation here, a shared meal there, a willingness to stand beside someone during their hardest season. These are the bricks of a life that feels whole. And when I looked back, I saw that my own healing had come in exactly the same way, through countless small acts of courage, not a single sweeping transformation. I also learned to embrace solitude in a new way. Before, being alone often felt like rejection. Now, it felt like rest. I filled quiet hours with reading, writing, gardening, or simply sitting outside watching the world move. Instead of loneliness, I found renewal. It gave me space to reflect on where I had been and where I wanted to go. That shift turned solitude from something I read into something I valued. There were still days when old feelings resurfaced. Certain holidays or anniversaries brought back memories that stung. But the difference now was that I didn't let those feelings take control. I allowed them to surface, acknowledged them, and then returned to the present. It was like watching waves pass on the shore. I didn't need to drown in them anymore. That skill, more than anything, showed me just how far I had come. In the end, I realized my story was never about erasing pain, but about integrating it into a fuller picture of life. Betrayal had been part of my path, but so had resilience, connection, and growth. What mattered most was not what had been taken from me, but what I chose to create afterward. As I think about the future now, I see it less as a list of goals and more as a space to keep building meaning day by day. I want to spend more time with my grandchildren, to continue mentoring, to keep writing, and maybe even to travel to places I've only seen in books. But I also know that even if those dreams don't all unfold, the life I've created already holds depth and value. That realization is its own form of peace. When I look back at who I was at the beginning of this journey, the woman weighed down by silence, fear, and the sting of betrayal, I can hardly believe how much has shifted. I'm no longer defined by what others did to me. I'm defined by how I responded, how I grew, and how I continue to show up. That is the legacy I want to leave. Not perfection, but resilience. Not a life without pain, but a life that shows it's possible to keep moving forward, no matter what. And maybe that's the final truth I've learned, that life is not about waiting for the perfect ending, but about creating meaning in the middle of it all. Each day is an invitation to step into that meaning, to build connection, to share wisdom, and to live with honesty. That is enough. That is more than enough. After going through something like this, I kept asking myself, what happens when family pushes the boundaries even further, not just with things, but with the values you've held your whole life? That's a story I recently shared, and it might surprise you even more than this one. If you want to see how far things can really go, it's waiting for you right here,